Welcome to Her Secret Truth, a place where the truth always comes out. Here you'll hear stories of family betrayals, hidden secrets, and shocking revelations. Every story is a step closer to the truth someone tried to hide. Subscribe to Her Secret Truth so you don't miss new stories you won't be able to stop watching. My daughter married a wealthy Chinese man, and then completely cut me out of her life. She once told me plainly that people like them despise poverty, and in their eyes I was nothing more than a waitress. Not long after that, her mother-in-law even showed up at the restaurant where I worked just to humiliate me. With a mocking smile, she said that if I managed to serve her in her own language, she would give me $100,000. She laughed like it was a joke, but the moment I answered her in flawless Chinese, the reaction around the table was pure shock. Before I go further, tell me something first. Where are you watching from today? Leave your location in the comments below, and make sure to like and subscribe. Now let me take you back to where this whole nightmare truly started. Because you're probably wondering how a 50-year-old waitress ended up speaking fluent Chinese to the mother of a billionaire, while serving overpriced salmon at Romano's restaurant. About 3 hours earlier, I had been wiping down table 12 for the third time during that shift, my lower back aching in the familiar way that comes from 7 years of carrying heavy trays and forcing polite smiles. The lunch rush had been brutal. It was the usual mix of demanding tourists and local businesspeople who treated servers like pieces of furniture that occasionally brought them food. From behind the bar, Marcus called out to me that a group of 8 guests was asking for table 15, and the tone in his voice already hinted that this would not be an easy table. He added that they were the type of customers who spent a lot of money but expected perfection for every single dollar they paid. Table 15 happened to be in my section, tucked into the corner where the restaurant's most important guests like to hold private conversations. Over the years I had served politicians, celebrities, and plenty of self-important millionaires, so I thought I could recognize that type immediately. Still, nothing prepared me for what stepped through Romano's doors at exactly 7:30 that evening. Olivia walked in first, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than what I earned in 3 months. Behind her came a man I assumed must be her husband. He was tall and perfectly dressed, carrying the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from never having to worry about money. But the person who truly drew everyone's attention was the older woman walking behind them. Her silver hair was styled perfectly, her jewelry sparkled under the lights with every movement, and she carried herself with the kind of authority that made even confident businessmen step aside. That woman was Mrs. Grace Lynn, and although none of us knew it at the time, she had come that evening to destroy my daughter's marriage. From behind the wine station I watched as the host seated them. My heart tightened somewhere between pride and concern as I saw Olivia playing the role of the perfect daughter-in-law. She had always been good at adjusting to different situations, and for years I believed that ability would help her succeed in life. As it turned out, I had been wrong about many things. Soon the rest of the Lynn family filled the empty chairs around the table. There were aunts, uncles, cousins, all speaking quickly in Mandarin while Olivia kept smiling politely even though she clearly did not understand a single word. Victor, her husband, translated from time to time, but I noticed something strange. Every time he did, the rest of the family would suddenly pause their conversation, as if they had been discussing something they did not want her to hear. About 20 minutes into their meal, Mrs. Lynn lifted her hand and called out sharply for a waitress. Her voice carried the tone of someone used to being obeyed instantly. I walked over to their table with my professional smile in place and my notepad ready, greeting them politely and asking how I could help. Mrs. Lynn looked at me with the sort of dismissive expression people usually reserve for insects. She complained that the water glasses were empty, that the salmon had been overcooked, and that the wine selection was unacceptable for a restaurant claiming to offer fine dining. I nodded politely and told her I would speak with the kitchen about the salmon and ask our sommelier to recommend better options for the wine. She waved her hand impatiently, dismissing me as though I were a particularly annoying fly. As I turned to leave the table, I suddenly heard Victor whisper something urgently to Olivia. He sounded confused and said that she had never told him her mother was dead. My blood instantly ran cold. I stopped walking, every nerve in my body suddenly on edge. Olivia answered quietly, her voice barely audible, but I still heard every word. She explained that her mother had died when she was 22 years old in a car accident. The lie struck me like a physical blow. In my daughter's version of reality, I had been dead for 6 years. She had buried me in her past so she could marry into a family that apparently cared very much about the backgrounds of the people they accepted. But even that was not the worst part of what I was about to realize. For 6 years, Olivia had been telling her husband's family that I did not exist. I stood there holding a tray of dirty dishes, listening as my own daughter erased me from her life story. Something cracked inside my chest in that moment, and it was not just heartbreak. It was anger. You need to understand something about me. I had sacrificed absolutely everything for that girl. 8 years earlier, I was known as Margaret Bennett, the co-owner of Bennett & Associates Investment Consulting, a company my husband and business partner Daniel Bennett and I had built together into something truly special. Our firm specialized in international markets, especially the fast-growing economies across Asia. We had offices in downtown Seattle, a client list that looked like a Fortune 500 directory, and more than enough money to send Olivia to whichever college she dreamed of attending. Then Daniel decided our marriage had become dull, while our secretary had suddenly become fascinating. The divorce alone was devastating. But the real blow came when I discovered that my loving husband had been quietly transferring assets into accounts I had no access to. That was the moment I truly understood that loving someone does not protect you from betrayal. Daniel vanished together with our financial advisor, who it turned out was also his girlfriend, taking roughly $2.8 million and leaving me behind with a mortgage, overwhelming debt, and a business that could not survive without its main clients. Olivia was 20 years old when everything in her life collapsed. One day she was a sophomore at Northwestern studying international business. The next day she sat across from me, while I explained that she would have to transfer to a state school and find a part-time job. I promised her through tears that the situation was only temporary, and that I would rebuild everything we had lost. We were both crying in a house that was already half empty. She nodded while listening, but in that moment I saw something fade in her eyes. The belief that her mother could fix anything had disappeared, replaced by the harsh understanding that even successful people can lose everything in only a few months. For the next year I tried desperately to rebuild the company, but Daniel had already destroyed too many relationships. Former clients stopped returning my calls, and people who once eagerly scheduled meetings suddenly had no time for me. The few accounts that remained were not nearly enough to keep the business alive. By the time Olivia turned 21, I was working as a waitress at Romano's and living in a small one-bedroom apartment that constantly smelled like the Chinese restaurant downstairs. That was 7 years ago. During one of the dinners we still managed to have together, though those meetings were becoming rarer, Olivia told me I could not give up. She reminded me that I knew more about international investing than many men in Seattle, that I spoke 3 languages, and that I still had connections. I simply smiled and changed the subject, because I did not have the heart to tell her the truth. Connections only matter when people want to be connected to you. Success attracts friends everywhere, while failure usually ends up eating alone. Olivia eventually graduated summa cum laude with a degree in international business and a deep understanding of global markets. She was intelligent, ambitious, and completely determined that she would never experience poverty again. First she joined a small tech startup. Later she moved to a larger company, and eventually she landed a position at a consulting firm that worked closely with Asian corporations. That was where she met Victor Lin. Victor represented everything we had once lost: family wealth, social status, and the kind of financial security that allows people to make decisions based on preference instead of survival. From the few somewhat awkward meetings I had with him, he also seemed genuinely kind. He was polite, well-educated, and clearly deeply in love with my daughter. Their engagement happened quickly, and the wedding was organized within 3 months. Olivia apologized for the small ceremony, explaining that Victor's family preferred very intimate celebrations. I had felt hurt at the time but tried to understand. Wealthy families often had their own traditions. What I did not realize back then was that I was not simply being left out of those traditions. I was being erased from existence entirely. Standing inside Romano's and listening as Olivia told her husband that her mother had died when she was 22 in a car accident, I felt 8 years of buried anger suddenly harden into something sharp and focused. Mrs. Lin continued speaking about hardship and resilience, explaining how losing her mother so young must have helped shape Olivia's admirable independence. Victor held Olivia's hand supportively, and told her how proud he was of the strength she had shown while overcoming such a terrible loss. The entire performance was flawless. Olivia's eyes even filled slightly with tears while she spoke about how much she missed her mother every day, and how she wished I could have met Victor. For a moment I almost walked straight to the table to introduce myself to the grieving widow they were discussing. But something stopped me. Maybe it was years of training in customer service, or perhaps it was the conversation happening in Mandarin between Mrs. Lin and the elderly man sitting at the head of the table. They believed they were speaking privately, yet I understood every word they said. Mrs. Lin remarked that the girl had no family at all, no connections and no background that could create problems for them, adding that Victor had made a wise choice. The elderly man responded thoughtfully that perhaps that was true, though something about the girl still troubled him. He said she seemed to watch too closely whenever they spoke their own language. Olivia quickly reassured him, explaining politely that the girl was simply being respectful. Father. American politeness, Olivia said lightly. No, the old man replied in a firm voice. She watches in the way someone does when they understand more than they are willing to show. I do not like deception inside a family. If only he had realized how much deception was already sitting at that table. At that moment Mrs. Lin looked in my direction again, and I saw the exact second an idea appeared behind her perfectly made-up eyes. It was the kind of idea that would allow her to humiliate both the lying daughter-in-law and the working-class mother at the same time. She smiled, and the moment I saw that smile I knew trouble was coming. The Mandarin conversation continued for another 10 minutes while I pretended to wipe down nearby tables so I could remain within earshot. Mrs. Lin was calmly explaining her plan to the elderly man at the head of the table. Grandfather Lin, Victor's father's father and apparently the true patriarch of the family. If she is hiding a living mother who works as a servant, Mrs. Lin said, moving smoothly between Mandarin and English the way bilingual families often do, then perhaps we should see exactly what kind of family Victor has married into. Grandfather Lin listened without showing much emotion, only nodding occasionally. At 78 years old, he carried the kind of quiet authority that made younger relatives automatically straighten their backs when he looked at them. His suit was perfectly tailored, the watch on his wrist probably worth more than most people's cars, and nothing escaped his attention. So you want to expose the lie publicly? He said after a moment. I want to understand what else she might be hiding, Mrs. Lin answered. If she can lie about her mother being dead, who knows what else might not be true? Her education perhaps, or even her work experience. For all we know, the girl could be a complete fraud. From where I stood restocking wine glasses, I could see Olivia becoming increasingly uncomfortable during the long Mandarin conversation. She kept glancing toward Victor, who seemed torn between translating for his wife and continuing the discussion with his family. Finally Olivia asked what they were talking about, her smile still in place but slightly strained. Victor answered that it was simply family business, though the tone in his voice suggested he was not entirely comfortable with where the conversation was going. Mrs. Lin then switched back to English with the smooth confidence of someone who used multiple languages like tools. She turned to Olivia with a pleasant smile and mentioned that Victor had said she studied international business. Olivia answered confidently that she had studied at Northwestern. There was no hesitation in her voice, no sign of the lie she had been maintaining. Mrs. Lin then asked about her specialization. Olivia explained that she had focused mainly on Asian markets and had always been fascinated by economic development in China, especially the technology sector. That part at least was true. Olivia had written her senior thesis about Chinese technology companies and their strategies for expanding globally. What she did not mention was where she had learned to analyze international markets in the first place, or who had spent countless evenings teaching her how to read financial reports and understand the movement of currencies. Mrs. Lin smiled again and asked where that interest in Chinese business had come from. She suggested it might have been influenced by family. I watched my daughter's face closely because I knew she had entered dangerous territory. Olivia chose her words carefully and explained that she had always been interested in learning about different cultures and economic systems. She added diplomatically that global business requires a real appreciation for different perspectives. It was an excellent answer. Vague enough to avoid details but intelligent enough to sound impressive. Mrs. Lin agreed politely, though she remarked that studying such complex topics must have been difficult without family guidance. She added that orphans often struggle with subjects that require deeper cultural understanding. The word orphan lingered in the air like a deliberate challenge. Olivia kept smiling, but I noticed her hands tighten slightly in her lap. She replied that she had been fortunate to have excellent professors and mentors. Mrs. Lin continued speaking, explaining that family wisdom can be extremely valuable. She mentioned that her husband's father had built their family's first business from nothing, and that Victor had grown up listening to stories about negotiation tactics, cultural subtleties, and the importance of understanding not only what people say but also how they think. For the first time since the earlier discussion, Grandfather Lin spoke again. He turned toward Olivia and calmly asked whether she spoke any Mandarin. Olivia shook her head and admitted that unfortunately she did not. I have always intended to learn, Olivia admitted politely. Grandfather Lin responded thoughtfully, explaining that languages are like windows into people's souls. His English carried a noticeable accent, but every word was precise. He added that in business, especially when working with Chinese companies, language often shows whether someone truly has respect or not. I could see Victor beginning to grow uneasy under his grandfather's intense attention. He quickly tried to reassure everyone, explaining that Olivia had already been very successful working with international clients and that her results spoke clearly for themselves. Mrs. Lin smoothly interrupted, remarking that results can sometimes be interpreted in many ways. She added that success without deeper understanding may only last for a short time. The discussion was becoming pointed enough that other members of the family started paying attention. Aunts and uncles who had previously been talking among themselves now turned toward the table, clearly sensing that something dramatic might happen. Then Mrs. Lin spoke again, her voice carrying the tone of someone preparing to make an important suggestion. She proposed arranging a family dinner somewhere that would allow Olivia to demonstrate her knowledge of Asian business culture. Olivia answered politely that the idea sounded lovely, though there was a hint of tiredness in her voice. Mrs. Lin continued with a pleasant smile, saying she knew exactly the right place. It would be a restaurant where the staff could accommodate their family's preference for authentic communication, somewhere everyone could behave naturally. Grandfather Lin studied her quietly for a long moment before slowly nodding. He said the idea was interesting and asked when she had in mind. "Tomorrow evening," Mrs. Lin replied, and her smile carried the unmistakable satisfaction of a hunter who had already spotted prey. She added that she would take care of all the arrangements. While I stood nearby pretending to polish silverware that was already spotless, I realized I was witnessing something far more complicated than simple dinner planning. Mrs. Lin was not merely suspicious of Olivia's story. She was deliberately preparing a trap. And judging by the thoughtful look in Grandfather Lin's eyes, he was curious enough to let her set it. Around 9:30 that night, the family began getting ready to leave. Coats were gathered, farewells exchanged, and conversations flowed in a mix of languages that seemed perfectly natural to them. Olivia and Victor were among the last to walk out. As they passed my station, I caught a brief part of their conversation. Olivia remarked that Victor's mother seemed very pleasant, though the tone of her voice suggested she did not entirely believe what she was saying. Victor responded diplomatically, explaining that his mother could be protective when it came to family matters. He reassured Olivia that tomorrow's dinner would go well, and that once Mrs. Lin knew her better, she would show a softer side. Olivia nodded, but the worry in her eyes was impossible to miss. She sensed something was wrong, even if she could not yet understand what it was. After they left, I finished my closing duties almost automatically while my mind raced with everything I had heard. Mrs. Lin suspected that Olivia was hiding something, and was preparing to reveal it in front of everyone. What she did not realize was that her plan was about to give me the perfect opportunity for a conversation that had been waiting for 7 years. While driving back to my small apartment that night, I made a decision that would change everything. It was time for Margaret Bennett to stop being dead. That night I did something I had not done in 7 years. I prepared for battle. My apartment might have been small, but I had kept the most important things from my previous life. Financial journals, old business cards, correspondence files, and most important of all, my language materials. Just because my husband had stolen the company did not mean he could erase 2 decades of experience in international business. I pulled out my Mandarin study books, my Cantonese conversation guides, and the thick stack of business cards belonging to Chinese executives I had worked with in the past. Daniel might have destroyed my professional reputation in Seattle, but he had not destroyed my knowledge. Between the years 2003 and 2014, Bennett and Associates had focused on helping American companies enter Chinese markets. I had spent countless hours learning not only the language but also the cultural subtleties that could determine whether an international partnership succeeded or collapsed. I understood the concept of face, the delicate structure of hierarchy, and the ways respect was earned and maintained in Chinese business culture. I also knew exactly who grandfather Lin was, Lin Wei-ming. Back in 2009, when one of our clients was considering a partnership with Lin Industries, I had researched his company thoroughly. At that time he was building a massive renewable energy empire, starting with solar panel manufacturing and later expanding into wind turbines and advanced battery storage systems. What made him particularly fascinating was not just his success in business. It was his reputation for recognizing talent and mentoring capable people. Lin Industries was known for promoting employees based on ability rather than family connections, something quite unusual in family-dominated Chinese corporations. Even more importantly, I remembered something he had once said during an interview published in Harvard Business Review. He explained that business is ultimately about people. Technology evolves, markets change, but individuals who understand both numbers and human nature are the ones who create lasting success. Mrs. Lin's plan to humiliate Olivia was about to fail in a spectacular way, because she had made one crucial mistake. She assumed that revealing a waitress as someone's mother would shame both women. She had no idea that the person she was about to expose was once an investment consultant who had advised Fortune 500 companies on strategies for entering Asian markets. I spent 3 hours reviewing everything I could find about Lin Industries and their recent projects, their expansion into electric vehicle charging infrastructure, their partnership with the Seattle Port Authority on green energy initiatives, and their new research facility in Bellevue dedicated to advanced battery technology. By the time I finally went to bed, I had already formed a plan. The following morning, I called Romanos and told them I was sick. Marcus clearly did not like the news, though I promised him I would arrange someone to cover my shifts for the rest of the week. He sounded suspicious, pointing out that I almost never took time off and asking if everything was all right. I simply told him that there was some family business I needed to deal with, which in its own way was absolutely true. That morning I went shopping for something I had not worn in years. Professional clothing. Nothing flashy or overly expensive. I certainly could not afford designer brands, but something that suggested competence rather than desperation. I chose a simple black dress, a structured blazer, and shoes that would not immediately identify me as a restaurant worker. The rest of the afternoon I dedicated to research and preparation. I carefully reviewed Lin Industries' most recent quarterly reports, their environmental programs, and their expansion strategies. I also reread interviews with grandfather Lin, paying attention to his opinions about American business culture and his repeated concerns about sustainability. Most importantly, I prepared for the conversation I had been wanting to have with Olivia for 6 years. At 5:30 that evening, I drove to Romano's and parked across the street where I had a clear view of the entrance. Mrs. Lin had reserved a table for 8 people at 7 o'clock and specifically requested the same corner table they had used the previous night. She had also asked for the same waitress who had served them before. Marcus had confirmed that Margaret Bennett would be their server. Except Margaret Bennett was sitting quietly inside her car, watching Mrs. Lin's carefully arranged plan unfold exactly as expected. The Lin family arrived right at 7 o'clock, with Olivia and Victor appearing about 5 minutes later. Their timing was almost perfect, as though they had planned their entrance to make the strongest impression. I waited another 10 minutes to allow them time to order drinks and settle in. Then I entered Romano's through the kitchen door instead of walking through the front entrance. Marcus noticed me immediately. He looked surprised and reminded me that I had called in sick earlier that morning. I simply told him I was already feeling much better while adjusting my blazer. Then I asked whether the Lin party had been seated. He confirmed they were at table 15, exactly where they had requested to sit. Maria had been covering my section, but I told Marcus I would take that table personally. I explained that it was something I needed to handle myself. As I walked through the dining room, I carried myself with a confidence I had not felt in years. For the first time in a long time, I felt like the business executive I had once been rather than the invisible waitress people barely noticed. When I approached table 15, I could already hear Mrs. Lin speaking in Mandarin. Her voice had that unmistakable tone of anticipation that suggested she was about to set her trap. She was confidently explaining that the girls still did not understand their language, which meant the plan would work perfectly. When the girl's mother appeared, they would conduct the entire conversation openly in front of her so Victor could finally see what kind of family he had married into. Olivia looked increasingly uneasy, glancing around the restaurant as though she sensed danger somewhere nearby but could not identify where it was coming from. Meanwhile, Grandfather Lin sat silently, observing everything with the patience of a man who had spent decades making calculated decisions. I stopped beside the table holding my notepad and greeted them with a calm smile. I introduced myself as Margaret and explained that I would be serving them that evening. Olivia looked up, and I watched 7 years of lies crash directly into reality inside her eyes. The moment of recognition was almost electric. Her face turned completely pale, then flushed red, and then pale again. Her mouth opened as though she wanted to speak, but for a moment no sound came out. Mrs. Lin, who had been enjoying Olivia's reaction without understanding the cause, turned to look at me. She commented pleasantly that I was the same waitress who had served them the previous night. I answered in flawless Mandarin, keeping my tone calm and professional. I mentioned that the previous evening she had spoken about offering generous tips in exchange for proper service in her language. The silence that followed was absolute. Mrs. Lin's eyes widened as she realized I had understood every word spoken during their private conversation the night before. Grandfather Lin leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting from mild politeness to genuine curiosity. And finally Olivia found her voice. She whispered a single word, "Mom," and it hung in the air like an unavoidable confession. Mrs. Lin's expression changed rapidly through several emotions one after another. First confusion appeared on her face, then realization, and finally something that looked very much like embarrassment. She had been caught discussing her daughter-in-law's supposedly dead mother right in front of that same supposedly dead mother, and she had done it in a language she believed that mother could not understand. "I believe there has been some confusion," I said while continuing to speak in Mandarin and addressing Mrs. Lin directly. "Your daughter-in-law seems to have told you that I was deceased. However, I can assure you that the reports of my death were greatly exaggerated." Grandfather Lin actually smiled at that remark, a slight lift at the corner of his lips suggesting he appreciated both the language ability and the literary reference. Victor meanwhile looked like he might be sick. He stared at Olivia, then at me, and then back at Olivia again. In a quiet voice he reminded her that she had told him her mother died in a car accident. Olivia started to speak but stopped almost immediately. There was simply no good way to explain it. Mrs. Lin recovered her composure remarkably fast. Switching to English, she remarked that this situation was certainly unexpected. I agreed and also switched to English so Victor could follow the conversation. I added that I understood she had made a rather interesting offer the previous evening regarding language service and generous tips. The rest of the Lin family watched the exchange with open fascination. Clearly, this was not the kind of conversation that usually happened during family dinners. Grandfather Lin observed that I spoke Mandarin fluently, his tone neutral but clearly interested. I replied that I also spoke Cantonese and some Japanese because those languages had been necessary during my work in international business consulting. He asked what type of consulting I had done. Olivia made a small sound that could have been a quiet whimper. I explained that my main focus had been Asian market analysis. My work involved helping American companies understand Chinese business culture and identify investment opportunities. I paused deliberately before mentioning that my husband had stolen my company and disappeared together with my business partner. The honesty was strategic. It is always better to control the story yourself, rather than let someone else uncover the details first. Grandfather Lin responded with a thoughtful sound, and that single syllable seemed to carry a great deal of understanding. Betrayal can be very expensive. I added that this was the reason I had spent the last 7 years working at the restaurant, slowly rebuilding my life one table at a time. Mrs. Lin had been listening carefully, and it was becoming clear that she now realized how badly her plan had failed. Instead of revealing a humiliating secret, She had exposed a woman with exactly the kind of professional background and experience the Lin family respected. Victor turned toward Olivia, his voice tense, and asked why she had lied about something like this. My daughter looked around the table, surrounded by her husband's family, all of them waiting for an explanation that could somehow make sense of the last 24 hours. She tried to speak again, then took a deep breath before finally admitting that she had been ashamed. The words were barely louder than a whisper, but they were heard clearly across the table. Victor asked quietly what she had been ashamed of. Olivia explained that she had been ashamed of how far our lives had fallen, ashamed that we had lost everything, and ashamed that her mother had to wait tables because of what her father had done to us. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, though the pain in it was obvious. She said Victor's family had everything: money, status, respect, and she did not want them to know that we had once had all of that and then lost it. So instead you decided to declare me dead, I said dryly. That was very considerate. Olivia flinched. She admitted she had believed that if I did not exist, then our past would not exist either. She thought she could simply become the person she was now rather than the person who once had everything and then lost it. Mrs. Lin studied me again with a new level of interest. She asked me to repeat what my specialization had been. I answered that my work focused on Asian markets, especially Chinese technology sectors and renewable energy investments. I had spent a considerable amount of time analyzing emerging companies involved in solar and wind power development. Grandfather Lin became very still. He asked when this had taken place. I explained that most of the work happened between 2008 and 2014, mainly before the market truly exploded. He slowly repeated that I had been analyzing Chinese technology companies back in 2008. I nodded and added that among those companies, there had been one in particular that I found especially interesting. Lin Industries, I said. At that time it was still a small company, mainly focused on manufacturing solar panels, though there were already plans to expand into wind turbine production. The leadership looked strong, and the vision for integrating sustainable energy was impressive. Now I had his full attention. He asked if I had researched his company thoroughly. I explained that I had been advising a client who was considering possible partnership opportunities. I also told him that his strategy of combining traditional manufacturing methods with innovative technology had been fascinating and surprisingly forward-thinking for that period. Mrs. Lin looked from her father-in-law to me, clearly realizing that the conversation had suddenly taken a very different direction. Grandfather Lin asked what conclusion I had reached. I explained that my analysis suggested Lin Industries could become a major force in renewable energy, but only if the company secured enough capital to expand, while still maintaining its focus on quality and innovation. I added that I had recommended my client pursue a limited partnership combined with specific technology licensing agreements. He asked if they had followed that recommendation. I smiled and explained that they had not. They believed the Chinese market was too risky and decided instead to invest in a domestic solar company. He asked which company. I answered that it had been Solyndra. Grandfather Lin actually laughed. He pointed out that the investors had lost everything, $500 million in total. I confirmed that was correct and added that sometimes American companies are so afraid of risk that they fail to recognize real opportunity. By then the discussion had moved completely away from Olivia's lie and shifted towards something far more interesting: business strategy and missed chances. I could see Mrs. Lin trying to regain control of a situation that had already spiraled far beyond her original plan. She interrupted, saying the conversation was fascinating but suggesting they should focus again on the more immediate issue: honesty within family relationships. I agreed and turned toward Olivia. I asked if she would like to explain to her husband why she chose to pretend I was dead, rather than simply telling the truth about our situation. Olivia looked around the table, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Finally she admitted that she had been afraid. She explained that she feared Victor would not want to marry her if he knew the truth about our family's failure, and she was also afraid his relatives would believe she was only interested in money and status. Grandfather Lin asked bluntly whether she had been after money and status. Olivia remained silent for a long moment. Then she nodded and admitted that partly she had been. She explained that she had experienced poverty and hated it. She wanted security, and Victor represented that security. Victor then quietly asked about love. Olivia reached for his hand and said she did love him, but she also admitted she loved what he represented, even though she was not proud of that truth. Mrs. Lynn smiled in clear triumph and pointed out that Olivia had just admitted she married him for money. Grandfather Lynn disagreed calmly. He said she had simply admitted to practical thinking. He explained that if someone marries only for love, they may end up starving in a hut, while marrying only for money can feel like living inside a beautiful prison. But when love and practicality come together, people can build something truly worthwhile. Then he turned to me and said that my daughter was being honest now, which was more than many people manage. I agreed, though I remarked that if she had chosen honesty earlier, it would have saved everyone a great deal of embarrassment. Mrs. Lynn looked visibly frustrated. Her carefully designed plan to expose and humiliate someone had instead turned into what looked more like a family therapy session, mixed with unexpected business discussions. Grandfather Lynn said the real question now was what they should do with all this information. That was the moment I realized the evening was far from finished, and that the most interesting part was only beginning. Grandfather Lynn signaled to the waiter. It was not me this time but Marcus, who had been hovering nervously near our table for the last 10 minutes. He simply said they needed privacy and did not want any interruptions. Marcus nodded and quickly moved other diners away from the nearby tables, understanding that some conversations required space. Then Grandfather Lynn looked at me and told me to sit down, indicating an empty chair that had originally been placed for their planned 8-person dinner. I explained that I was working. He replied firmly that I was not working at that moment and that it had become a family meeting. His English was precise and his tone left no room for argument. So I sat. Mrs. Lynn looked like she wanted to protest, but it was obvious that Grandfather Lynn's decision was final in family matters. Then he focused his attention on Olivia and Victor, and said it was time to discuss the truth, every part of it. No more lies, no more shame, and no more hiding. He addressed Olivia first, stating that she had lied about her mother because she was afraid the family would judge their poverty. Olivia nodded miserably in agreement. Then he turned to Victor and pointed out that Victor had never asked difficult questions because he preferred comfortable lies. Victor admitted that was also true. Victor flushed slightly but still nodded in agreement. Then Grandfather Lynn turned to Mrs. Lynn and addressed her calmly. He pointed out that she had suspected lies yet chose public humiliation instead of having a private conversation first. After a moment, Mrs. Lynn's lips tightened, but she also nodded. He continued by explaining that every one of them had made decisions based on fear and pride, emotions that can become very expensive both in business and in family life. Leaning back in his chair, he added that now the problems would be solved using facts rather than feelings. Then he looked at me. He summarized my situation with remarkable efficiency. Margaret Bennett, former business consultant specializing in Asian markets, who lost everything because of her husband's betrayal, had been working as a waitress for 7 years but still understood international business, spoke 3 languages, and raised a daughter who became successful despite a family disaster. It was a concise and accurate summary. Next he spoke about Olivia. He described her as educated, ambitious, and someone who married both for love and for security. He added that she had been intelligent enough to maintain a convincing lie for 6 months, something that required planning and emotional control. Those, he said, could actually be useful skills when used honestly. Olivia looked surprised, as if she had not expected what almost sounded like praise. Then he addressed Victor, describing him as kind-hearted, trusting, and successful in business but somewhat naive about people. Victor needed to learn that comfortable lies could be far more dangerous than difficult truths. Victor slowly nodded. Finally, he spoke to Mrs. Lynn, explaining that she was protective of the family and suspicious of outsiders but sometimes misjudged when suspicion was helpful and when it became destructive. Mrs. Lynn's expression suggested she did not entirely enjoy that evaluation, though she did not argue. Now, Grandfather Lynn said calmly, it was time to discuss what would happen next. He took out his phone and made a short call in rapid Mandarin. From what I understood, he was asking someone to bring files from his car. While we waited, he explained that in business a crisis often reveals people's true character, and that tonight had been very educational. A young man soon arrived carrying a leather briefcase. He placed it beside Grandfather Lynn's chair and left quickly. Grandfather Lynn opened the briefcase and removed several documents. Turning toward me, he mentioned that I had advised against investing in Solyndra. Then he asked what I would have recommended instead. The question clearly felt like a test, so I thought carefully before answering. I explained that in 2008 I would have recommended dividing the investment among 3 companies. First Solar for its established technology, Lin Industries for its innovative potential, and BYD for market access. Equal shares with different risk profiles covering the major segments of the market. He repeated the name BYD. It was a Chinese company producing batteries and electric vehicles. I added that Warren Buffett had invested in that company about 6 months after I wrote my recommendation. Grandfather Lin smiled and pulled another document from the briefcase. It was a Lin Industries investment partnership proposal written in 2009, which had never been implemented because the American company chose Solyndra instead. He slid the paper across the table. I immediately recognized it. It was my original proposal written on Lin Industries' letterhead, filled with handwritten notes that I now realized were in Grandfather Lin's handwriting. I looked at him with surprise and asked if he had really kept it all these years. He replied that he kept all interesting proposals, especially ones written by consultants who understood his business better than most. After a brief pause, he added that my analysis had been excellent and that my client had simply been foolish. Mrs. Lin watched this exchange with growing realization that the evening was unfolding in a way she had never anticipated. I reminded him that the proposal was written 8 years ago. Grandfather Lin responded that good business ideas do not expire. They simply wait for the right time and the right people. Then he pulled out another document and explained that it was Lin Industries' current expansion plan, which included electric vehicle charging infrastructure, residential solar integration, battery storage systems, and expansion into the American market. He explained that they needed an American business consultant who understood both Chinese thinking and American markets, someone with experience, language ability, and cultural knowledge. I stared at the document, still unsure I was understanding correctly, and asked if he was offering me a job. He answered that he was offering an opportunity to rebuild what I had lost, working with a different company but using the same expertise. Olivia watched the conversation with complete shock on her face. She gestured around the restaurant and asked what that meant for my current career. I asked her what she meant exactly. She clarified with a hint of nervous humor that she meant my prestigious career in food service. Mrs. Lin had become very quiet, apparently realizing that her attempt to humiliate a waitress had instead introduced her father-in-law to exactly the consultant he had been looking for. Grandfather Lin continued that the opportunity would come with conditions. No lies, no false identities, no hiding past failures or present circumstances, and complete honesty about abilities and limitations. Then he looked directly at Olivia and added that those conditions applied to the entire family. Olivia's eyes filled with tears, but this time they looked more like relief than fear. She said quietly that she could be honest. Grandfather Lin replied that Margaret Bennett's daughter should never feel ashamed of Margaret Bennett. Instead, she should feel proud that her mother survived betrayal and continued fighting. He closed the briefcase and stood up, saying I should think about the proposal, and that they would meet again the following week to discuss the details. As the Lin family prepared to leave, Grandfather Lin approached me once more. In a quiet voice he said that my husband had been a foolish man who threw away both an excellent business partner and an excellent woman. His mistake, he added, created an opportunity for people who knew how to recognize real value. After the family left, Olivia stayed behind while Victor went to bring their car to the entrance. She looked at me and spoke in a barely audible voice. She said she was sorry, truly and deeply sorry. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her for the first time in years. You should feel sorry, I told her. But being sorry alone does not repair anything. What matters now is what you decide to do next. She asked quietly what she should do next. I explained that she needed to learn to tell the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. She needed to learn to be proud of her family even when we are imperfect. And she needed to understand that running away from problems never makes them disappear. Olivia nodded while tears ran down her face. Then I added one more thing. I told her she should probably learn Mandarin because if she intended to remain part of that family, she ought to understand what people were saying about her. Despite everything that had happened, Olivia actually smiled. For the first time in 7 years, it felt as though my daughter was genuinely glad that I was still alive. 3 days later, I found myself sitting inside the Bellevue headquarters of Lin Industries. I was wearing the first real business suit I had owned in 8 years, and the experience felt like stepping back into a life I had once believed was gone forever. The building itself was impressive, glass and steel architecture that somehow felt both modern and timeless. Solar panels covered the roof in such numbers that they could probably power a small city. Inside, the reception area displayed awards for environmental innovation, alongside traditional Chinese art pieces that reflected the company's cultural heritage. Grandfather Lin's assistant, an efficient woman named Mei Lin, had called the day after our dinner to arrange what she described as a preliminary consultation meeting. During the days between the call and the meeting, I had spent hours researching everything I could find about Lin Industries, their latest projects, their competitors, and the challenges surrounding their expansion plans. What I discovered was fascinating. The company had grown enormously since my analysis back in 2009, yet their presence in the American market was still limited. Cultural barriers and complicated regulations were slowing their expansion, exactly the type of problems I knew how to solve. Mei Lin eventually returned and informed me that Mr. Lin would see me now. She led me through a hallway lined with photographs showing renewable energy installations around the world. Grandfather Lin's office was surprisingly simple. A large desk, comfortable chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Seattle skyline. There were no flashy displays of wealth, only the practical environment of someone focused on serious business. He stood up to greet me and thanked me for coming. I replied that I appreciated the opportunity. Then he gestured for me to sit across from his desk. Before discussing business, he said he wanted to understand something. He asked why I had accepted the meeting. It was a reasonable question. I explained that he was offering a chance to use skills I had assumed were permanently useless, and that his company represented exactly the type of organization I had always hoped to work with. He asked whether my decision was related to Olivia. I admitted that Olivia played a small part in my reasoning, but the main reason was simpler. After 7 years of waiting tables, I was tired of feeling invisible. He nodded with approval and commented that people who work only for family become weak, while people who work only for money become cruel. Those who work for both, however, often become strong. Then he opened a folder on his desk. He told me that he had researched Margaret Bennett and Bennett and Associates very thoroughly. My stomach tightened slightly. He continued by explaining that my former clients still spoke highly of my work. Even after 8 years, they remembered my analysis as accurate, my cultural understanding as valuable, and my language abilities as impressive. After a short pause, he added that those same clients spoke very poorly about my husband. According to them, Daniel had destroyed many relationships after stealing the company's money. I responded that Daniel had always been stronger in charm than in character. Grandfather Lin agreed calmly, noting that true character only reveals itself when someone faces pressure. Then he said this observation brought him to the current situation. He slid several documents across his desk toward me. They outlined Lin Industries' American expansion strategy, a 5-year plan divided into 3 stages involving residential solar installation, commercial battery storage, and electric vehicle charging infrastructure. I reviewed the documents quickly, studying the market analysis, financial projections, and regulatory considerations. The timeline was ambitious, so I asked what was driving the urgency. He explained that competition was increasing because American companies were finally realizing renewable energy was not a temporary trend. If Lin Industries waited too long, entering the market would become much more difficult. I asked about the main challenges. He replied that the problems were the same as always. Many American businesses did not trust Chinese corporations. Government approvals took far too long, and successful local partnerships required cultural understanding his team did not yet possess. Looking up from the papers, I explained that these were solvable issues with the right consultant. He agreed and said they needed someone who understood both sides, someone capable of translating not only language but also ways of thinking. I asked what type of role he had in mind. He answered that he envisioned a senior consultant position responsible for American business development, reporting directly to him, with compensation appropriate for the responsibility. Then he named a salary figure that made me blink. It was more than I had ever earned even during the most successful years of Bennett and Associates. I told him that was extremely generous. He shook his head and calmly replied that it was not generosity at all. It was simply practical. Skilled consultants are expensive. Bad consultants cost even more money, he added calmly. I prefer the first option. I nodded, then asked another question. I wanted to know how my possible position at his company might affect Olivia's standing within the family. Grandfather Lin remained silent for a moment before answering. He explained that Olivia created the problem through dishonesty, so she would have to repair it by proving she could be trusted. My work performance, however, was a completely separate matter. He continued by explaining the principle very clearly. If I failed, the failure would be mine alone. If Olivia failed, that failure would belong to her. Success and failure, in his view, were individual responsibilities. It was a refreshingly straightforward arrangement. I told him I would like to examine the materials in greater detail before giving a final answer. He agreed and told me to take 1 week. Then he paused and added that the opportunity existed only because I had demonstrated both expertise and honesty when I was tested. According to him, those qualities were rare. As I gathered the documents, he asked one final question. He wanted to know what I believed was the biggest mistake my husband had made in business terms. I considered the question carefully before answering. I explained that Daniel had mistaken exploiting people for intelligence. He believed short-term profit mattered more than long-term relationships. Then Grandfather Lin asked what my own biggest mistake had been. That question was harder to answer honestly. Eventually I admitted that I trusted someone to value our partnership as much as I did. I had failed to protect myself from betrayal. He nodded and said those were good answers. Trust, he explained, is necessary in business, but verification is necessary for survival. As I walked back toward my car, I felt something I had not experienced in 8 years: professional excitement. The Lin Industries project was exactly the type of work I had always loved. International business development, cultural bridge building, market strategy, and analytical problem solving. It was everything I was genuinely skilled at. But even more important, it represented a chance to rebuild my life on my own terms. I could rely on my own abilities rather than depending on anyone else's loyalty or honesty. My phone buzzed with a message from Olivia. She wrote that Victor had told her about the meeting and that she was proud of me. She also apologized for taking so long to say it. I smiled and replied that pride is not something someone simply gives. It is something that must be earned. Then I thanked her anyway. For the first time in 7 years, it truly felt as though Margaret Bennett was coming back to life. And this time I was not sharing ownership of that life with anyone. During the following week, I prepared for what felt like the most important business decision I had faced in years. The documents from Lin Industries revealed a company standing at a critical point of expansion. They were successful enough to take major risks, but not so established that failure would be harmless. Their strategy for entering the American market was intelligent but incomplete. They understood the technological challenges of renewable energy infrastructure, yet they underestimated the cultural and political difficulties of operating in the United States as a Chinese corporation. That was precisely where my experience would be valuable. On Friday morning, I contacted Mei Lin and arranged a follow-up meeting. She told me that Mr. Lin would see me on Monday at 10 o'clock, and that he wanted me to prepare a preliminary analysis of the market entry challenges. That weekend I worked harder than I had in years. I reviewed market data, regulatory frameworks, and the competitive environment. I also researched public attitudes toward Chinese companies operating in American markets, because success would depend not only on technology, but also on reputation and public trust. On Monday morning, I arrived at Lin Industries carrying a 30-page analysis and a clear set of recommendations. Grandfather Lin welcomed me and gestured toward the conference table where several executives were already seated. He introduced me to his senior team. The introductions were conducted in both English and Mandarin, which immediately demonstrated my language abilities. The group itself was impressive. Engineers, financial analysts, and marketing specialists who clearly understood their fields very well. The head of American operations, Director Zhang, explained that the team had already reviewed my professional background and asked for my opinion about their expansion timeline. I answered immediately that their timeline was too aggressive. Attempting to enter 3 separate market segments at the same time would divide their resources and weaken their focus. The room became very quiet. Apparently they had not expected criticism so quickly. Grandfather Lin simply asked me to explain my reasoning. I pointed out that many American companies remain suspicious of Chinese businesses, especially in technology sectors. Launching 3 major initiatives simultaneously would likely be perceived as an aggressive invasion rather than a cooperative partnership. That perception would slow regulatory approval, increase public resistance, and give competitors time to organize opposition. Director Zhang asked what I recommended instead. I suggested a sequential strategy. The company should begin with residential solar installation because it is politically acceptable and widely supported by consumers. After building credibility and relationships through that success, they could expand into commercial battery storage and eventually into electric vehicle charging infrastructure. One executive pointed out that this plan would delay their timeline by 2 years. I replied that it would make the timeline achievable. Fast failure, after all, is still failure. Grandfather Lin smiled slightly and asked me to continue. I added that the company also needed American partners, rather than only American customers. By forming joint ventures with established local companies, firms that lacked advanced manufacturing capabilities but needed their technology, Lin Industries could reduce political resistance and gain market credibility. Then I opened my folder and began distributing copies of my analysis to everyone at the table. I explained that I had identified 6 possible partners in the solar installation sector, 3 in battery storage, and 4 in electric vehicle charging infrastructure. All of them had complementary capabilities and well-established customer bases. The room stayed quiet while everyone reviewed the recommendations. Director Zhang observed that this approach would require patience. Grandfather Lin responded calmly that any worthwhile success requires patience, and that quick success is usually temporary success. For the next 2 hours we went through my analysis carefully, discussing every detail. The team asked thoughtful questions, challenging my assumptions and testing my understanding of market dynamics. It felt exactly like the kind of productive business meeting I had missed for so many years. As the meeting ended, Grandfather Lin said that the preliminary assessment was excellent and that now they needed to discuss practical matters. Once the other executives had left, he handed me a formal offer letter. The position was Senior Consultant for American Business Development, with a base salary, performance bonuses, equity participation, and a negotiable starting date. I read the terms slowly and carefully. The compensation was generous, the responsibilities were substantial, and the equity portion could become very valuable if the American expansion succeeded. I told him it was more than I had expected. He replied that good consultants create value far beyond their salary, and he expected me to be a good consultant. I accepted the offer. We shook hands, and the feeling of satisfaction that came over me was something I had not experienced since the earliest days of Bennett and Associates. Then Grandfather Lin mentioned one more thing. He said Olivia and Victor had requested a meeting that afternoon because they wanted to discuss their family situation. I was not entirely sure what that meant, but I agreed to meet them at a coffee shop near Olivia's office. Olivia and Victor arrived together. They both looked nervous but determined. Olivia began by saying they wanted to talk about our relationship. She explained that she and Victor had discussed everything that had happened and realized they needed to make some changes. I asked what kind of changes they were talking about. Victor answered that it meant honesty, complete honesty. No more lies, no more hiding, and no more pretending to be something they were not. I told them that sounded like a good beginning. Olivia continued by saying that they wanted to rebuild their relationship with me. She admitted she had hurt me deeply by pretending I was dead, and that she knew earning back my trust would take time. I agreed that it would. Victor said they still wanted to try if I was willing. I looked at my daughter carefully, really seeing her perhaps for the first time since she had been a child. She was still beautiful and ambitious, but there was something new in her expression. Something that looked like genuine regret mixed with determination to do better. I told Olivia that I would always love her, but love alone cannot sustain a relationship. Trust, respect, and real concern for one another are the true foundations of family. She said she understood and wanted to earn those things. I replied that we could try, but it would take time and consistent effort from both of us. Victor then reached across the table and took my hand. He apologized for never asking the right questions earlier, and said he should have realized that someone as capable as Olivia must have come from a family that helped shape her success. I told him he could simply call me Margaret and that his apology was accepted. We spent another hour discussing practical matters, family dinners, holidays, and expectations about communication. It felt both strange and wonderful to plan a future that once again included my daughter. As we stood up to leave, Olivia asked one final question. She wanted to know if I was happy with the job and with how everything had unfolded. I thought about it carefully before answering. I told her that I felt satisfied for now, but happiness is something I would still need to build, just like everything else in my life. She asked if they could help. I said they could try, but first she needed to learn Mandarin. If she was going to be part of the Lin family, she should understand what they were saying about her. Olivia laughed, and for the first time in years the sound felt completely genuine. Walking back to my car, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in just 1 week. From an invisible waitress to a senior business consultant, and from an estranged mother to someone cautiously hopeful about family again. Yet the most important change happened inside me. For the first time since Daniel's betrayal, I truly felt that I controlled my own future, and that feeling was worth more than any title or salary. 6 months into my position at Lin Industries, I was reviewing quarterly expansion reports when Mei Lin knocked on my office door. She told me someone was there to see me and insisted the matter was urgent. I lifted my head from the spreadsheets that had occupied my entire morning and asked who it was. She replied that Daniel Bennett was in the lobby and claimed to be my ex-husband. The coffee cup slipped from my hand, smashing on the floor while hot coffee splashed across my shoes. 8 years, 8 full years of silence, and now Daniel was standing in the lobby of my new workplace. Mei Lin asked if she should call security after seeing my reaction. I told her not to. Instead, I stood up and adjusted my jacket. I asked her to send him up but to keep my office door open and remain nearby. I had 3 minutes to prepare for a conversation I had imagined countless times but never truly expected to face. When Daniel entered my office, he looked older, grayer, and far less confident than the man who had once destroyed my life. Even his expensive suit could not hide how exhausted and desperate he appeared. He stopped just inside the doorway and commented that I looked successful. I answered calmly that I was successful and did not invite him to sit. Then I asked what he wanted. Daniel mentioned hearing about my position at Lin Industries and noted that the company was a major player in renewable energy. I asked if that was what he came to discuss my career. He shifted awkwardly and explained that he wanted to talk about us, about what happened, and about trying to make things right. The audacity of that statement was almost unbelievable. I told him he had not made simple mistakes. He had committed deliberate theft. He had stolen our company, our money, and 8 years of my life. Daniel pleaded for a chance to explain. I asked what exactly he intended to explain. Was it the way he systematically transferred assets into accounts I could not access? Or how he convinced our financial advisor to help him while she was secretly involved with him? Or perhaps how he left me buried under debt with a mortgage I could not pay? Daniel flinched at every accusation, yet he did not deny them. Finally, he said he had been in a difficult situation. According to him, the business had been struggling, and he believed he could fix it by taking control before everything collapsed. I stared at him in disbelief. I asked whether he truly justified his actions by convincing himself he had been saving the company by stealing it. He insisted Bennett and Associates had been failing, losing clients and missing payments, and that he had done what he thought was necessary. I asked what had happened to the company after he took it. Daniel remained silent. I repeated the question until he admitted it had not worked out as planned. I reminded him that the company collapsed within 2 years, meaning he destroyed everything we built for nothing. He blamed the market conditions. I answered that the market had not been the problem. He had been. At that moment, Mei Lin appeared in the doorway and informed me that Mr. Lin had arrived for my 2 o'clock meeting. The timing could not have been better. Grandfather Lin entered the office, looked at Daniel once, and instantly understood this was not an ordinary business discussion. I addressed him in Mandarin and explained that Daniel Bennett was my former husband and business partner, and that he had just been leaving. Grandfather Lin examined Daniel with the careful attention someone might give a suspicious insect. Then he said in his accented English that he had heard much about him, and none of it favorable. Daniel looked between us, clearly realizing the conversation was no longer private. He asked who the man was. I introduced Lin Wei Ming as the founder and chairman of Lin Industries, my employer. and the leader of a company worth far more than anything Daniel had ever built. The introduction was deliberate. Daniel had always admired wealth and status, and Grandfather Lin possessed both on a scale Daniel could hardly imagine. Daniel tried to shake his hand, claiming he had founded the company where I learned my consulting skills. Grandfather Lin ignored the offered handshake completely. He said calmly that Daniel had founded nothing. Instead, he stole from his partner, destroyed the business, and abandoned responsibility. Those actions belonged to a thief, not a founder. Daniel's face turned red as he insisted the situation was more complicated. Grandfather Lin replied that he understood the situation perfectly. A man who betrays a business partner will betray anyone. A man who steals from his wife has no honor, and a man who defends such actions has no character. His calm tone somehow made the judgment even more devastating than anger would have. Daniel turned back to me and asked if we could speak privately. I refused and reminded him that he lost the right to private conversations the moment he stole my company and disappeared. He argued that he had not disappeared and claimed he had been running a consulting firm in Portland. Grandfather Lin asked whether the business was successful. Daniel hesitated before admitting things had been difficult. I translated the hesitation bluntly. It had failed, just like everything else he touched after leaving me. Daniel protested that my comment was unfair. I stood up, my voice rising as I answered. If he wanted to talk about fairness, then fairness would have meant discussing our financial problems honestly instead of stealing from me. Fairness would have meant divorce proceedings that did not leave me nearly homeless. Fairness would have meant showing at least some respect for the woman who helped him build everything he later stole. Daniel slowly looked around my office, noticing the expensive furniture, the wide view of Seattle's skyline, and the awards and certificates that marked my success. Finally, he admitted that I had done well for myself. I corrected him calmly and explained that I had rebuilt what he destroyed. I had done it without his help, without his money, and without his approval. He said he was glad to see that, and for a brief moment he even sounded sincere. He added that he had always known I was talented. I asked him then why he had chosen to steal from me. The question remained hanging in the room, unanswered. I asked again what he actually wanted. Daniel said he wanted to make things right. He wanted to repay what he had taken. Grandfather Lin made a quiet sound that might almost have been laughter. I asked Daniel if he truly believed he could repay 8 years of stolen income. Could he restore the professional reputation he had ruined? Could he repay the stress, the humiliation, and the countless nights I worked double shifts at a restaurant because my business partner stole my livelihood? Daniel replied softly that he could at least try. Grandfather Lin suddenly asked him a direct question about the amount he actually had available to repay the debt. Daniel hesitated and admitted that he did not have much liquid capital. If he sold some assets, he might manage about $50,000. The silence in the room became heavy. Grandfather Lin calmly reminded him that the original theft was $2.8 million. When 8 years of interest, lost income, and damage to my reputation were considered, the total loss would be around $15 million. Daniel turned pale. Grandfather Lin then said that $50,000 was not a serious repayment but an insulting gesture. Daniel tried to explain that the amount might seem small, but it was all he could offer. Grandfather Lin replied that the amount was not small. It was meaningless. Offering $50,000 for that kind of loss was like giving a single grain of rice to a starving person. I looked at the man who had once been both my business partner and my husband, and I felt something I had not expected. I felt pity. Quietly I told Daniel that I did not want his $50,000. I did not want his apology either. In truth, I did not want anything from him. He asked what he could do then. I told him he could leave. He could return to Portland and his struggling consulting business and never contact me again. I added that he should remember something clearly. The woman he once believed he had destroyed was now more successful than he ever managed to be. The company he stole and ruined had been replaced by something far better. And his betrayal, the clever act he once felt proud of, had actually freed me to build a life he never could have given me. Daniel watched me for a long moment and then slowly nodded. He said he was sorry. I told him I knew he was sorry, but apologies do not undo damage. They simply mean someone finally understands the cost. After he left, Grandfather Lin and I sat in silence for several minutes. Eventually he remarked that it had been a difficult conversation. I replied that it had also been a necessary one. Some ghosts must be faced before they can finally be buried. Then I said it was time to return to work, because the quarterly reports would not analyze themselves. Grandfather Lin smiled slightly and said it was a good answer. The past, he explained, should create lessons, not limitations. That evening I called Olivia and told her about Daniel's unexpected visit. After listening to the story, she asked how I felt about it. To my own surprise, I answered that I felt relieved. For 8 years I had been angry at a memory, but seeing him again made me realize that the memory had been far more powerful than the reality. Olivia asked what I meant by that. I explained that Daniel was simply a middle-aged man who had made terrible choices and had been living with the consequences ever since. He was not the monster I had imagined for years, just someone who betrayed his own principles and lost everything important. Olivia asked whether I forgave him. I thought about the question carefully. Forgiveness suggests that what someone did can be forgiven. In this case it could not. But I also refused to let his decisions continue controlling my life. Olivia said that sounded healthy. I agreed and told her it truly felt healthy, like finally putting down a weight I had carried for years without realizing how heavy it was. Then she said she was proud of everything I had accomplished, proud of how I handled the situation that day, and proud of the person I had become. I thanked her and told her that hearing those words meant more than she probably realized. After our call ended, I sat on my apartment balcony looking out over the Seattle skyline and thinking about the strange path that had brought me to that moment. 8 years earlier, Daniel's betrayal had felt like the end of my world. That night it felt like the beginning of something far better. 2 years after Daniel's visit, I was sitting in the boardroom of Lin Industries' new American headquarters reviewing quarterly reports showing that our United States operations had exceeded every projected target for the third consecutive quarter. The residential solar division was now operating in 12 states. Our commercial battery storage partnerships had expanded to include major retailers and manufacturing companies. The electric vehicle charging infrastructure project was ahead of schedule and even under budget. More importantly, we had achieved something I once believed impossible when I first examined their expansion plans. Lin Industries was now viewed as an American success story that simply happened to be Chinese-owned, rather than as a Chinese invasion of American markets. Grandfather Lin reviewed the same reports from his seat at the head of the table and said that the American expansion had surpassed all expectations. Around the table sat the senior leadership team, half American executives and half Chinese expatriates, representing exactly the kind of cultural cooperation that makes complex international business truly succeed. Margaret, Director Zhang said, the partnership with Morrison Electric has requested expansion into 5 additional states. They want to triple their solar installation capacity. That is excellent news, I replied. It moves us ahead of the timeline for Phase 3 implementation. At that moment my phone buzzed with a message from Olivia. She wrote that we had dinner planned that evening because Victor's parents were visiting and wanted to see me. I smiled and typed a quick reply telling her I was looking forward to it. Over the previous 2 years, my relationship with Olivia had slowly rebuilt itself. It was not exactly the same mother-daughter connection we had when she was younger, but in many ways it had become stronger. We had developed something closer to a friendship between 2 adults who respected each other's abilities and chose to value family connection. Olivia and Victor's marriage had also grown stronger once honesty became the foundation of their communication. Victor discovered that Olivia's ambition and survival instincts were qualities he admired rather than feared. And Olivia realized that Victor's genuine kindness was not a weakness to take advantage of, but a strength to appreciate. Grandfather Lin eventually closed the meeting and congratulated everyone on the excellent work. As the room began to empty, he asked me to remain behind. He then said he had another proposal for me, another expansion project, though this one involved a different kind of expansion. He called it personal expansion. I was not sure what he meant. He explained that Lin Industries' European division needed a senior consultant to lead renewable energy market development. The role would be based in London and involve travel throughout the European Union. According to him, it would be an excellent opportunity for someone with my experience. The offer was intriguing and completely unexpected. I joked that it almost sounded like he was trying to get rid of me. Grandfather Lin laughed and said the opposite was true. He wanted to give me an opportunity for growth that the American division could no longer provide. I asked what would happen to the American operations if I left. He explained that the American division was successful because of the systems I had created, the partnerships I had negotiated, and the cultural bridges I had built. Those systems, he said, were strong enough to continue without constant supervision. He was right. The American expansion had succeeded because we created sustainable structures and reliable partnerships, rather than relying on constant crisis management. I repeated the word London while considering the idea. The assignment would last 2 years and include a salary increase, housing allowance, and equity participation in the European expansion. Afterward, I could return to Seattle whenever I wished. I asked why he had chosen me. He explained that European markets presented cultural challenges similar to those in the United States, but operated under a completely different regulatory environment. My ability to translate Chinese business thinking into Western business frameworks made me uniquely qualified. It was an enormous opportunity, the kind of career advancement I never imagined possible after Daniel's betrayal. I asked if I could take some time to think about it. Grandfather Lin agreed but reminded me that the offer represented recognition of exceptional performance. Lin Industries did not send average consultants on international assignments. That evening I met Olivia, Victor, and his parents at a restaurant that had become our usual place for family dinners. It was not Romano's, I had never returned there, but a quiet neighborhood restaurant where we could talk comfortably. As we ordered wine, Olivia immediately noticed something in my expression and asked if I was excited about something. I told them about the offer to work in London leading European market development. Victor's mother looked delighted and said the opportunity sounded wonderful, though she admitted the family would miss me. I explained that it would only be for 2 years and that I had not made a final decision yet. Olivia asked what was holding me back. I admitted that I had spent the last decade rebuilding my life in Seattle. My apartment, my career, and our restored relationship were all here. Everything I had worked so hard to rebuild existed in that city. Olivia gently reminded me that only 2 years earlier I had been waiting tables and we had not spoken for 6 years. She pointed out how dramatically life could change when someone was willing to take chances on new opportunities. She was right. Victor added that he and Olivia had actually been discussing the possibility of spending a year in London themselves. His company wanted to open a European office, and Olivia had received a consulting offer from an international development firm. Olivia explained that if I accepted the position, they would try to coordinate their timing so all of us could be in London together. The idea of building my career in London, while also having family nearby, suddenly sounded very appealing. I looked around the table and asked what everyone thought I should do. Victor's father answered thoughtfully that successful people take calculated risks whenever the potential reward is greater than the possible cost. I think, Victor's mother added gently, that you have earned the right to pursue opportunities that truly excite you, not only the ones that feel safe or secure. I think, Olivia said, that my mother is incredibly talented and capable, and she deserves the chance to see just how far her abilities can take her. And I think, Victor continued thoughtfully, that Grandfather Lin does not make offers like this without careful consideration. If he believes you are ready for a challenge like this, then you probably are. Looking around the table at these people who had become my family not through blood or obligation, but through choice, patience, and effort, I realized something important. For the first time in my adult life, I was about to make a decision based entirely on possibility instead of fear. I told them that I was going to accept the offer. The table immediately filled with congratulations, laughter, and excited discussions about London neighborhoods and weekend trips to Paris. Later that evening, sitting alone in my apartment while looking out over Seattle's skyline one more time, I thought about the strange path that had led me there. 5 years earlier, I had been a waitress being mocked by a customer who spoke a language she assumed I could not understand. The next day I would be accepting a role as a senior international consultant for one of the world's largest renewable energy companies. The transformation had nothing to do with luck. It came from recognizing that my knowledge, experience, and skills had value, regardless of what others chose to see. I picked up my phone and called Grandfather Lin. When he answered, I told him clearly that I accepted the offer. He responded that it was an excellent decision and asked when I could begin. I requested 2 months to transition my current projects and arrange my move. He agreed immediately and welcomed me to Lynn Industries Europe. After the call ended, I poured a glass of wine and quietly raised it in a toast to my empty apartment. I toasted to second chances and to never allowing anyone to make me invisible again. The reflection in the window showed a 52-year-old woman who had once lost everything and somehow rebuilt a life better than she had ever imagined. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not destroying the people who hurt you. Sometimes it is succeeding so completely without them that they simply fade from your story. And sometimes, if fortune is truly kind, the ending of one chapter becomes the beginning of a far better one. 5 years later, I would be sitting in my London office reading an email from Olivia about her promotion to partner at her consulting firm, while reviewing expansion plans for Lynn Industries' renewable energy projects in Africa. But that is a story for another time. Today's story ends with a woman who discovered that being underestimated only becomes a disadvantage when you start believing it yourself. I stopped believing it the moment I answered Mrs. Lin's challenge in flawless Mandarin and watched her realize that the waitress she tried to humiliate was actually the consultant her family needed. Some lessons are worth 7 years of waiting tables to learn. Some victories require a lifetime of preparation. And sometimes a single conversation can change everything, especially when you have the perfect words ready in exactly the right language. Where are you watching from today? Thank you for joining me on this journey. Like and subscribe if this story reminded you that it is never too late to reclaim your strength and rewrite your ending. The best chapters of your life might still be waiting to be written. Thanks for listening. And do not forget to subscribe, and feel free to share your own story in the comments. Your voice truly matters.